Close your eyes for a moment, not for long, just long enough to let go of everything you know. The roads outside, the hum of your devices, the century you were born into. Let it all drift back, further and further, until the cities you know are gone, until the languages you speak have not yet been invented, until even the oldest stories you are ever told are still thousands of years from being written down. Now open them again. You are standing at the edge of a river. Two rivers, in fact, the Tigris and the Euphrates, curling like twin veins through a broad, sun-warmed land between what we now call the Persian Gulf and the mountains of what is now Turkey. The Greeks would one day give this land a name drawn from their own tongue, Mesopotamia. The land between the rivers, a name that sounds ancient because it is, a name that deserves to be spoken slowly, the way the land itself demands to be understood. And somewhere within that land, rising from the flat alluvial plain like a dream that refused to stay sleeping, a city began. Babylon. The very sound of it carries weight. It always has. Long before historians catalogued its streets and linguists decoded its tablets, the word Babylon moved through human memory as something more than a city. It was an idea, a warning, a wonder, a world. To the ancient Hebrews who wrote of it in scripture, it was the seat of exile and power. To the Greeks, it was one of the greatest spectacles the earth had ever produced. To the Romans who came after, it was legend made stone. And to us, thousands of years removed from its last golden age, it remains one of the most compelling places any civilization has ever built. But Babylon did not appear fully formed. Nothing that extraordinary ever does. The story begins not with kings or conquests, but with the simplest and most human of needs, water, soil, and time. Around 4000 BCE, 6,000 years ago, the land of southern Mesopotamia was home to the Sumerians, a people whose contributions to human civilization are so foundational that we are still, in countless quiet ways, living inside them. They invented writing. They organized the first cities. They tracked the stars with careful, patient eyes and began to suspect that the sky held patterns that could teach them something about the earth below. Into this already ancient world, another wave of people arrived, the Akkadians, a Semitic-speaking people from the north, who merged with Sumerian culture in the way that great rivers sometimes merge, turbulently at first, then with a kind of irresistible, beautiful force. From this confluence came something new, and from something new. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. In the city-state nestled along the Euphrates that the Akkadians called Bab Ilim, meaning, with quiet poetry, the gate of God, came Babylon. It was not yet the Babylon of legend, not yet. In its earliest centuries, it was a modest administrative center, a trading post of some importance, but not yet the jewel of the ancient world. That transformation would come slowly, the way all truly lasting things come, through the accumulation of generations, each one adding a layer, a wall, a law, a story, until the structure that emerges is no longer the work of any single pair of hands, but the work of a people across time. And what a people they were. The Babylonians were traders and farmers, astronomers and architects, poets and priests, lawyers and lovers. They built ziggurats, great stepped temples that rose above the flat plains like man-made mountains, visible for miles in every direction, intended not merely to impress, but to connect the earth to the heavens, the mortal to the divine. They wrote in cuneiform, pressing the blunt ends of reeds into clay tablets, leaving behind records so durable that we are still reading them today, business receipts and love poems, medical diagnoses and mathematical proofs, hymns to gods whose names we are only beginning to pronounce correctly. At its height, Babylon was the largest city on earth. a place of perhaps 200,000 souls, an almost incomprehensible number for the ancient world, living within walls so massive that the Greek historian Herodotus claimed, perhaps with some exaggeration but perhaps not, that a chariot could be turned around on top of them. Wide, processional boulevards ran through its heart. Gardens, the legendary, perhaps mythical, hanging gardens, may have risen in terraced splendor beside the royal palace, irrigated by a system of pulleys and waterways that defied the flat, dry logic of the landscape. It was a city that seemed to insist on the impossible, and then quietly delivered it. This is the story of that city, not just its kings, though the kings are extraordinary, not just its wars, though the wars shape the world, but the full, breathing, complicated life of a civilization that rose from a river plain and taught humanity things it has never quite unlearned. Settle in, we have time. There is something quietly remarkable about the idea of a law, not the law itself, not yet, but the idea behind it. The notion that a society with all of its competing desires and grievances and hungers could agree to be governed not by the mood of whoever held the most power on a given morning, but by a set of written principles that applied, at least in theory, to everyone beneath the sky. It sounds simple now. It was not simple then. It was, in the truest sense of the word, revolutionary. And the man who understood this most completely, who shaped this idea into something that would echo across 4,000 years of human history, was a king named Hammurabi, a man who ruled Babylon not merely with armies, but with ink pressed into clay, a man who looked at a fractured, restless empire and decided that what it needed most was not more soldiers, but a system. To understand Hammurabi, though, we must first understand the Babylon he inherited. Because he did not begin as the ruler of an empire. He began as the king of a city-state of modest size and considerable ambition, inheriting the throne from his father, Sin-Muballit, around 1792 BCE. Babylon at this point was one player among many in a crowded, competitive Mesopotamian world. To the south were the Sumerians and their ancient city-states, still proud and still powerful. To the north was Assyria. To the east, the kingdom of Eshnunna. To the west, the kingdom of Mari, whose royal archives, discovered centuries later by archaeologists, would prove to be among the most extraordinary windows into ancient political life ever uncovered. It was a world of shifting alliances, cautious diplomacy, and calculated warfare. A world that rewarded patience. Hammurabi was, above all things, patient. For the first 3 decades of his reign, he consolidated, negotiated, and waited. He built up Babylon's infrastructure, temples, irrigation systems, the slow civic work that rarely makes it into legends but forms the bones of every lasting civilization. He corresponded with other kings in letters that, remarkably, survive. Letters that reveal a man of sharp political intelligence, someone who understood that the pen and the messenger could accomplish things that the sword could not, at least not without enormous cost. And then, when the moment arrived, when the alliances had ripened and the armies were ready and the stars, which the Babylonians read with extraordinary care, were deemed favorable, Hammurabi moved. Within a span of roughly 10 years, he dismantled the regional powers that surrounded him one by one, with a methodical precision that his contemporaries must have found both impressive and unnerving. Lhasa fell, Eshnunna fell, Mari fell, its magnificent palace looted but largely preserved, a fact for which historians are quietly, endlessly grateful. Assyria was subdued. By around 1755 BCE, Hammurabi ruled an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the upper reaches of the Euphrates. He was, without serious question, the most powerful man on earth, and he knew that power of that magnitude, over people of that many different languages, customs, and traditions, required something beyond military force to hold it together. It required legitimacy, And so he built it. Literally, the Code of Hammurabi, carved into a pillar of black diorite stone nearly 8 feet tall, topped with a bas-relief image of Hammurabi standing before the seated sun god Shamash, receiving divine authority for the laws below, was not, strictly speaking, the first legal code in history. The Sumerians had produced earlier legal texts, and Hammurabi himself likely drew on existing regional traditions. But in its scope, its ambition, and its sheer symbolic power, nothing that had come before it quite matched what Hammurabi commissioned and set in the public square of Babylon for all to see, or rather, for all to have read aloud to them, since most of his subjects could not read. That detail matters. These laws were not intended merely for scholars or scribes. They were meant to be known, to be heard, to form, in the minds of the Babylonian people, a shared understanding of what was right and what was wrong, and what would happen when those lines were crossed. The code contains 282 laws, covering an astonishing range of human situations. There are laws governing commerce and contracts, loans and interest rates, wages and working conditions. There are laws about marriage, divorce, and the rights of women, which, while far from equal by modern standards, were considerably more substantial than many people expect from a civilization of this age. A woman could own property. She could conduct business. She could initiate divorce under certain circumstances. These were not small things in 1754 BCE. There are laws about adoption, about inheritance, about what happens when a builder constructs a house that collapses and kills its owner. There are laws about physicians and their fees, and their liabilities, which were severe if a patient died under their care. There are laws about tavern keepers, most of them women, who are warned quite seriously against watering down their beer. The penalties, in this instance, were remarkably harsh, which tells you something about how seriously the Babylonians took their drink. And then, of course, there is the principle for which the code is most often remembered, though also most often oversimplified: an eye for an eye. The concept of proportional justice. That the punishment should match the crime. That no wrongdoing should be met with a consequence wildly disproportionate to the harm caused, was not invented by Hammurabi, but it was codified by him with a clarity that the ancient world had not quite seen before. The phrase itself, in its original cuneiform form, carries a weight and a rhythm that translation softens but cannot entirely erase. It was not a call to cruelty. It was, in its historical context, a limitation on cruelty. It said, this far and no further. It said that justice had a shape, and that shape was proportionality. To read through the Code of Hammurabi today, and you can, in translation, within an afternoon, is to experience one of the strangest and most affecting sensations that the study of history can produce. Because the people in these laws are so recognizable. The contractor who cuts corners, the employee who feels underpaid, the spouse who feels betrayed, the creditor pressing a debtor who cannot pay, the neighbor whose ox has wandered into someone else's field and caused damage. These are not abstractions. These are people. Complicated, imperfect, entirely human people navigating a world that was, in its daily texture, more familiar than we tend to imagine. Hammurabi understood his people. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about him. He called himself, in the famous prologue to the Code, written in the first person with a poet's ear, the shepherd of his people, not the conqueror, not the warrior, the shepherd, the one who protects, who guides, who watches over those in his care. Whether he lived up to that self-description is a question history leaves partially open, but the aspiration itself, the idea that a king's greatness was measured not only in the territory he held, but in the justice he provided, was a genuinely extraordinary thing to declare in the early 18th century BCE. He ruled for 42 years in total. When he died, around 1750 BCE, the empire he had assembled began almost immediately to unravel, as empires so often do when the singular force that shaped them is no longer present. His successors struggled. External pressures mounted. Within a generation or two, the grand Babylonian empire of Hammurabi's reign had contracted sharply, the outer territories peeling away like bark from a tree no longer tended. The pillar stood. The words pressed into clay were copied and recopied by scribes for centuries, studied in scribal schools across Mesopotamia, the way students today study foundational texts. They were not forgotten. They could not be forgotten, because they had been written down, carefully, deliberately, in a language designed to last. And in that writing, Hammurabi had done something that even the mightiest armies cannot do. He had made himself permanent. The stone pillar that bore his code survived the fall of Babylon, survived the Persian conquest, survived the Greek conquest, survived Alexander, and every empire that came after. In 1901, French archaeologists excavating at the ancient site of Susa in modern-day Iran pulled it from the earth, largely intact. Today it stands in the Louvre, in Paris, still bearing those 282 laws, still crowned with that image of a king standing before his God, still proclaiming, across 4,000 years of silence, that there was once a man who believed that justice was worth writing down. He was not wrong. Every great civilization produces a great city. But not every great city becomes something more than a city, something that functions in the minds of the people who live in it, and the people who fear it, and the people who have only heard of it from 1,000 miles away, as a kind of axis around which the known world quietly turns. Babylon was that kind of city. At its peak, roughly in the 6th century BCE, under the reign of the king Nebuchadnezzar II, a name we will return to at length, Babylon was home to somewhere between 100 and 200,000 people. Those numbers may sound modest to modern ears, accustomed to megacities of millions. But in the ancient world, they were staggering. To walk into Babylon in 600 BCE was to enter the largest, most complex, most deliberately constructed urban environment on Earth. It was to enter a place that had been planned, not merely grown, not merely accumulated, but planned, by minds that understood space and symbolism and the particular psychology of awe, because Babylon was not just built to house people, it was built to astonish them. Begin at the walls. Always begin at the walls, because in Babylon they were the first thing you encountered and the last thing you forgot. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who visited the city in the 5th century BCE, and whose account, though sometimes exaggerated, sometimes disputed, remains one of our most vivid primary sources, described walls so broad at the top that 2 4-horse chariots could pass one another without difficulty. Modern archaeology has not fully confirmed every dimension Herodotus recorded, but excavations have revealed walls of genuinely extraordinary scale. A double ring of defensive fortification, the outer wall stretching for miles around the city, punctuated by towers placed at regular intervals, constructed from millions upon millions of fired mud brick, baked in the Babylonians of fired mud brick, baked in the Babylonian sun, and mortared together with natural bitumen, which seeped from the earth in this region, in quantities that the Babylonians learned early to put to extraordinary use. The walls were not merely defensive, they were a declaration. They said, to anyone approaching across the flat Mesopotamian plain, what lies beyond us is worth protecting. What lies beyond us is unlike anything you have seen before. And through those walls, one primary entrance dominated all others, the Ishtar Gate. If there is a single physical object that most completely embodies the ambition and the beauty and the theological imagination of Babylon at its height, it is the Ishtar Gate. Commissioned by Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century BCE, and dedicated to Ishtar, the goddess of love and war. a pairing the Babylonians saw no contradiction in. The gate rose to a height of nearly 40 feet, its surface covered entirely in glazed brick of a blue so deep and so saturated that visitors who encountered it for the first time are recorded as having been stopped in their tracks. Not stopped by surprise, stopped by beauty. There is a difference, and the Babylonians understood it. Across that deep blue field moved animals, not painted animals, sculptured animals, raised relief figures of dragons and bulls and lions, alternating in careful rows, each one a symbol of a specific deity, each one rendered with a confidence and a naturalistic precision that even today, viewed in the reconstructed version that stands in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, produces something close to reverence. The Mudiyu Sai, the dragon of Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, a sinuous creature with the body of a serpent, the forelegs of a lion, and the hind legs of an eagle, moves along those walls with a fluid, almost living grace. It is the work of artists who cared deeply, who understood that the entrance to a great city was also a theological statement, a prayer rendered in fired clay and mineral blaze, permanent and gleaming beneath the Mesopotamian sun. Through the Ishtar Gate, one entered the processional way, a wide, stone-paved boulevard that ran through the heart of Babylon, lined on both sides by walls bearing lions in relief, the symbol of Ishtar herself, striding forward in perpetual procession. During the Babylonian New Year festival, the Akitu, one of the most important religious celebrations in the ancient world, a 12-day ceremony that celebrated the renewal of creation and the reconfirmation of the king's divine mandate. This road came alive. The great statue of Marduk was carried in procession along its length, accompanied by priests and musicians, and the population of the city, pressed together in a collective act of devotion and celebration that must have been, by any measure, one of the great spectacles of the ancient world. The processional way led ultimately to the great ziggurat of Babylon, Etemenanki, a Sumerian name meaning, with characteristic Babylonian grandeur, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, a stepped temple tower of 7 levels rising to a height that modern scholars estimate at somewhere between 200 and 300 feet, its summit crowned with a temple to Marduk so high that it was said the god himself came down to sleep there. Some historians have suggested that Etemenanki was the inspiration for the Tower of Babel described in the Hebrew scriptures, a building so tall, so audacious, so expressive of human ambition reaching toward the divine, that it entered the mythology of neighboring peoples and stayed there, a permanent monument to the idea that Babylon always wanted more than what was merely possible. But step back from the monuments for a moment, step back from the gates and the ziggurats and the processional roads, important as they are, because Babylon was not only its grandeur, it was also its streets. The residential quarters of Babylon were a dense, intricate network of lanes and neighborhoods, houses built from the same mud brick as everything else, clustered around interior courtyards that provided shade and airflow in a climate that demanded both. Babylonian houses turned inward, away from the street, their exteriors plain and unadorned, their interiors organized around the courtyard that served as the domestic center of daily life, where children played, where women managed the considerable complexity of a household economy, where cooking was done and textiles were produced, and the 10,000 small negotiations of family life were conducted morning to night. The people who lived in these houses were not abstractions. They were merchants who rose before dawn to reach the market, scribes who spent their days hunched over clay tablets recording transactions and legal agreements and the slow administrative work of a complex state, priests who maintained the temples and the sacred calendars, and the enormous institutional wealth that the temple complexes controlled. They were farmers from the surrounding countryside who brought their grain and their dates. Babylon was surrounded by vast date palm groves, and dates were a dietary staple of fundamental importance into the city markets. They were artisans, potters and weavers, metalworkers and jewelers, brewers producing the barley beer that was so central to Babylonian daily life that workers were sometimes paid in it. They were women managing households with a legal and economic agency that surprises many modern readers. Babylonian women could own property independently of their husbands. They could lend money at interest. They could appear in court. Certain categories of women, the Naditu, a class of celibate women associated with the temples, engaged in business activities with a sophistication and a scale that would not be matched in many later Western societies for another 2,000 years. The records of their transactions survive on clay tablets, written in the same cuneiform script used for everything else, patient and precise, and entirely unremarkable in tone. Because in Babylon, a woman conducting business was not remarkable. It was ordinary. Children attended schools, the Ejubah, or tablet house, where they learned cuneiform by copying texts onto clay, beginning with simple lists and graduating over years to literature, mathematics, and the complex legal vocabulary required for professional scribal work. The curriculum included the great Babylonian literary texts, the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, and most significantly, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving work of literature in human history. The story of a king who loses his closest friend and travels to the ends of the earth in search of immortality, only to discover, in a moment of devastating clarity, that immortality was never available to him and that the life he was given is the life he should have treasured. It is a story about grief. It is a story about friendship. It is a story about the terror of death and the complicated consolation of being alive. And it was written, pressed into clay by hands that have been dust for 4,000 years in Babylon. That is not a small thing. That is perhaps the largest thing there is. A city that built monuments to its gods while also writing with aching honesty about what it felt like to be a human being afraid of dying is not merely a great ancient city. It is a mirror. And when you look into it clearly, across all those thousands of years of silence, what looks back at you is not something foreign and strange. It is something you recognize. There is a question worth sitting with before we begin this segment. Not a complicated question. In fact, it is a very simple one. But simple questions, asked of ancient civilizations, have a way of opening into something unexpectedly vast. The question is this: what did the Babylonians believe? Not in the abstract, theological sense that historians sometimes reduce to lists of deities and their associated symbols, but genuinely, what did an ordinary person living in Babylon in the 7th century BCE believe about the sky above them, the ground beneath them, the forces that shaped their harvests and their health, and the fates of their children? What did they think the universe was, and where did they believe they stood within it? The answer is richer, stranger, and more scientifically consequential than most people expect, because the Babylonians did not separate their religion from their science. For them, the two were not different activities. They were the same activity, approached from the same direction, aimed at the same fundamental goal: understanding the patterns that governed existence, so that human beings might navigate them with something approaching wisdom. Begin with the gods, because the gods were everywhere. The Babylonian pantheon was vast and layered, inherited in large part from the Sumerians who preceded them, and then expanded, reshaped, and reimagined across centuries of theological development. At its summit sat the great triad: Anu, the god of the heavens, ancient and somewhat remote, the father of gods; Enlil, the god of wind and storm and the earth's breath, volatile and powerful; and Enki, called Ea in Babylonian, the god of wisdom, water, and magic. patron of craftsmen and scribes, a deity of quietly subversive cleverness, who appears throughout Babylonian mythology as the god most sympathetically disposed toward humanity. Below this triad moved dozens of other deities, each governing a specific domain of natural and human experience. Ishtar, the goddess we met carved in glazed brick relief on the walls of her namesake gate, was the goddess of love and fertility and war, a combination that the Babylonians found entirely coherent because they understood, in a way that was theologically sophisticated rather than merely inconsistent, that the forces driving creation and the forces driving destruction were not opposites. They were expressions of the same overwhelming energy, channeled differently. Shamash was the sun god, and also the god of justice, a connection that was not metaphorical but literal, because in Babylonian thought, the sun that illuminated the physical world was the same divine force that illuminated right from wrong. It was Shamash who was depicted at the top of Hammurabi's law stele, handing the king his authority to legislate. The laws of human society and the laws of the cosmos were, in Babylonian understanding, aspects of a single order. Nana was the moon god, called Sin in his Akkadian form, and of all the heavenly bodies, the moon held a particular place of importance in Babylonian religious and scientific life. The Babylonian calendar was lunar. Their months began with the first visible crescent of the new moon, and the careful tracking of that crescent by temple priests stationed on the high platforms of ziggurats, watching the western horizon at dusk with trained and patient eyes, was both a religious duty and an astronomical practice of remarkable precision. And this is where the story of Babylonian belief becomes something truly extraordinary. Because the priests who watched the sky were not only praying, they were recording, night after night, decade after decade, century after century. The astronomical observations of Babylonian temple astronomers were pressed into clay tablets and stored in the great temple archives. The movements of the moon, the appearances of Venus, called Nindarana, the Lady of Heaven, and the other visible planets, the dates of lunar eclipses, the rising and setting times of stars, accumulated over generations into an archive of celestial data, so extensive, so carefully maintained, so methodically organized, that when Greek astronomers encountered it centuries later, they were confronted with something they had no equivalent of, empirical data spanning hundreds of years. The Babylonians did not have telescopes. They did not have the mathematics of calculus or the physics of gravity. What they had was time, patience, and an institutional commitment to observation that was without precedent in the ancient world. And from those ingredients, time, patience, and the willingness to look carefully and write down what they saw, they extracted results that still cause astronomers today to pause in something approaching admiration. They calculated the length of the lunar month to within a fraction of a second of the value we use today. They identified the Saros cycle, the roughly 18-year period after which lunar eclipses repeat in a predictable pattern, and used it to predict eclipses with an accuracy that was, given their tools, almost incomprehensible. They tracked the movements of the 5 visible planets and developed mathematical models, not physical models, not theories about what the planets actually were, but purely mathematical descriptions of how they moved, that could predict planetary positions weeks and months in advance. This was not astrology in the dismissive sense the modern world sometimes uses. This was something harder to categorize and more honest to call by its proper name, the world's first systematic astronomy, conducted within a framework that did not distinguish between the divine and the natural, because, for the Babylonians, no such distinction existed. When a Babylonian astronomer priest predicted a lunar eclipse, he was not merely performing a calculation. He was reading the intention of the gods. When the eclipse arrived as predicted, on the night and at the hour that the clay tablets had foretold, it confirmed something that the Babylonians believed with a depth that went far beyond intellectual conviction, that the universe was ordered, that it operated according to principles that could be understood, that the patterns embedded in the movements of the sky were the same patterns embedded in the movements of human life, that above and below were not two different realms but one single, coherent, intelligible reality. This belief, that the heavens and the earth were mirrors of one another, gave rise to astrology in its original serious form, not the newspaper column variety, but a genuine attempt to correlate celestial events with earthly ones, to find in the sky a kind of running commentary on the state of kingdoms and harvests and royal health. The omen texts produced by Babylonian scholars, enormous compilations called the Enuma Anu Enlil, spanning 70 or more tablets and recording thousands of celestial omens and their associated earthly meanings, represent one of the most ambitious intellectual projects in the ancient world. Whatever we make of their conclusions, the project itself was scientifically motivated. It was an attempt to find correlation, to identify pattern, to build a predictive model of reality from observed data. That it operated within a theological framework does not make it less rigorous. It makes it distinctly, irreducibly Babylonian. The great creation epic of Babylon, the Enuma Elish, its name taken from its opening words, meaning when on high, was recited in full during the Akitu festival each new year, a ritualized retelling of the moment when order emerged from chaos. In it, the god Marduk defeats the primordial chaos, dragon Tiamat, and from her body fashions the world, her eyes becoming the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates, her body becoming the sky and the earth. It is a creation story of extraordinary poetic power, but it is also, in its own way, a cosmological statement, an assertion that the world is not arbitrary, not random, not the indifferent product of meaningless forces, but the intentional creation of a mind that imposed structure on chaos and called that structure good. The Babylonians lived inside that story. They enacted it annually in their great festival. They confirmed it nightly in their astronomical observations, and they passed it forward to the Persians who conquered them, to the Greeks who came after, to the Hellenistic astronomers who built on Babylonian data, the foundations of what would eventually become Western science. When we trace the history of astronomy back to its origins, back past Copernicus and Ptolemy and Hipparchus, past the great Greek tradition that Western science often claims as its sole ancestor, we arrive, inevitably, at the ziggurat platform, at the temple scribe with his clay tablet and his reed stylus, at the Babylonian priest-astronomer scanning the horizon at dusk, watching for Venus, recording what he saw, pressing the observation into clay that would survive him by 4,000 years. We arrive, in other words, at Babylon. The gods they worshipped are gone now, or rather, transformed beyond recognition into other traditions, other names, other stories. But what those gods inspired, the systematic, patient, reverent attention to the patterns of the universe, that did not go with them. It is still here. It has never left. We have simply, in the long journey from then to now, forgotten where it came from. There are kings who inherit greatness. There are kings who stumble into it, and then, rarely, perhaps once or twice in the span of a civilization, there is a king who seizes greatness with both hands, shapes it deliberately, and leaves behind a city so transformed by his vision that even the ruins of it, even the dust of it, carry his name 4,000 years later. Nebuchadnezzar II was that kind of king. He came to the throne of Babylon in 605 BCE, the son of Nabopolassar, a man who had himself accomplished something extraordinary, breaking Babylon free from Assyrian domination and founding the Neo-Babylonian Empire, sometimes called the Chaldean Empire, that would represent the final and most dazzling flowering of Babylonian civilization. Nabopolassar had won the freedom. Nebuchadnezzar would build the monument, but first he had to win the world. In the very year he came to power, while his father still lived, Nebuchadnezzar commanding the army on his behalf. He met the forces of Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish on the banks of the Euphrates in what is now southern Turkey. Egypt was then the dominant power in the western reaches of the ancient Near East, its armies under the pharaoh Necho II pressing northward with imperial ambition of their own. The battle that followed was one of the most consequential military engagements of the ancient world. The Babylonian forces did not merely win, they shattered the Egyptian army so completely that Egypt would never again project meaningful military power into the Levant. In a single afternoon on the banks of a river, the balance of the ancient world shifted. Babylon stepped into the space left behind, and everything to the west, Syria, Phoenicia, the small kingdoms of the Levant, fell under its shadow. It was in this shadow that the kingdom of Judah found itself. And it is here that the story of Babylon intersects with one of the most consequential threads in all of human religious history. Judah, the southern Hebrew kingdom centered on Jerusalem, had navigated the turbulent politics of the ancient Near East with the anxious diplomacy of a small state caught between larger powers, sometimes paying tribute, sometimes attempting alliance, sometimes miscalculating badly. Under Nebuchadnezzar, the miscalculations became catastrophic. In 597 BCE, after a Judahite rebellion against Babylonian authority, Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem and took it. He did not destroy it, not yet. Instead, he did what Babylonian kings did with conquered elites. He deported them. The king of Judah, the royal family, the priests, the craftsmen, the scribes, the educated class, thousands of people, the very people who carried within them the institutional memory and the theological sophistication of Judahite culture, were taken to Babylon. Then came a second rebellion, and in 587 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar's patience ended. He returned to Jerusalem with his army, besieged it again, and this time showed no restraint. The city was taken after a siege of terrible suffering. The walls were torn down. The Temple of Solomon, the great temple that sat at the center of Judahite religious life, the house of the God of Israel, a structure of legendary beauty and theological importance, was burned to the ground. More deportations followed. The second wave of Babylonian exile had begun. What happened next? In Babylon, among the exiled Hebrews living beside the rivers of a foreign land, is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of human religion, because the destruction of Jerusalem and the deportation to Babylon did not destroy Judahite faith. It transformed it. In exile, stripped of their temple, their city, their king, and their land, everything that had previously anchored their religious identity to a specific place, the exiled Hebrews did something extraordinary. They internalized their faith. They shifted from a religion tethered to a physical temple in a specific city to something more portable, more textual, more inward. Scholars believe that significant portions of what would become the Hebrew Bible were compiled, edited, and given their final form during the Babylonian exile. Scribes and priests who had been brought to Babylon, living in a city of overwhelming grandeur and theological sophistication, wrote and preserved and shaped the texts that would eventually become foundational to Judaism, and through Judaism to Christianity and Islam. In other words, the city that destroyed Jerusalem helped create the Bible. That is not a small irony. It is perhaps one of the most consequential ironies in the history of civilization. Nebuchadnezzar himself appears in those texts, in the book of Daniel, in the book of Jeremiah, in the accounts of Kings and Chronicles, as a figure of enormous, sometimes terrifying power, an instrument of divine judgment, a king whose pride was eventually humbled by the God of the Hebrews he had so thoroughly defeated militarily. The famous story of Nebuchadnezzar's madness, his descent into a state in which he lived like an animal in the fields, eating grass, until his sanity was restored and his humility established. Has no confirmed historical basis in Babylonian records, but its presence in the Hebrew scriptures tells us something important about how deep an impression this king made on the people who experienced his power most directly. Even in their stories about his humiliation, the sheer force of him is undeniable. And what was he building? While all of this history was unfolding around him, he was building the greatest city the ancient world had ever seen, the Babylon that Nebuchadnezzar constructed, or rather, expanded, elaborated, and elevated beyond anything his predecessors had managed, was a deliberate act of world-making. He rebuilt the Ishtar Gate in the brilliant blue glazed brick we have already described. He expanded the Great Processional Way. He constructed or renovated the enormous temple complex of Marduk. He built and rebuilt the city walls until they were among the most formidable defensive structures in the ancient world. His building inscriptions, which survive on clay cylinders buried in the foundations of his buildings, a Babylonian tradition of dedicating construction to the gods, describe his projects with a pride that is entirely unabashed and entirely earned. He was not a modest man. He did not pretend to be. And then there are the Hanging Gardens. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, listed by later Greek writers as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, are, historically speaking, one of the most tantalizing and frustrating subjects in all of ancient studies, because we cannot confirm them. No Babylonian text has yet been found that describes them. No archaeological excavation has definitively identified their remains. They exist in the ancient record almost entirely through Greek and Roman sources, written centuries after the fact, describing a structure of such improbable beauty. A multi-terraced garden rising like a green mountain above the flat Babylonian plain, irrigated by an elaborate system of chains and buckets drawing water from the Euphrates, planted with trees and flowers and vines that cascaded downward in a living waterfall of color and scent. That some modern scholars have suggested they may never have existed in Babylon at all, but were perhaps confused with gardens in Nineveh, the Assyrian capital. Others disagree. The absence of Babylonian textual evidence, they point out, may simply reflect the gaps in what has survived. The city was enormous. The archives were vast. What we have recovered is a fraction of what existed, and so the Hanging Gardens remain suspended, appropriately enough between history and legend, present enough to demand attention, elusive enough to resist final confirmation. They are, in this way, a perfect emblem of Babylon itself, a civilization of such extraordinary achievement that even the stories we cannot entirely prove about it feel, somehow, plausible, feel like the kind of thing that Babylon would do. What is certain is that the city Nebuchadnezzar presided over was, by the standards of its age, without equal. Merchants from Egypt and Persia, from the Indus Valley and the shores of the Mediterranean, moved through its markets. Its temple libraries contained texts accumulated across 2,000 years of Babylonian scholarly life. Its astronomers continued their nightly vigil on the ziggurat platforms, pressing observations into clay, refining their mathematical models of the sky. Its poets composed hymns. Its scribes copied and recopied the Epic of Gilgamesh. Its brewers produced their carefully regulated beer. Its children learned cuneiform in their tablet schools. Its women conducted their business, managed their households, maintained their legal identities in a world that acknowledged them as persons with rights and claims and a place in the civic order. It was, in every sense that matters, a civilization at full height. And full height, in the ancient world, as in all worlds, is a place no civilization can occupy forever. Below every zenith lies the long, slow arc of descent. Below every greatest moment lies the question of what comes after. What came after Babylon was, in its own way, as extraordinary as Babylon itself. But that is the story of the next segment. Every civilization that has ever risen has also fallen. This is not a pessimistic observation. It is simply the most honest thing history teaches us, repeated so consistently across so many centuries and so many cultures that to be surprised by it is to have not been paying attention. Empires end, cities empty, languages fall silent. The question that separates the merely great civilizations from the truly consequential ones is not whether they fell. They all fell. But what they left behind when they did. Babylon left behind almost everything. But before the legacy, there was the ending. And the ending, when it came, arrived with a swiftness that must have stunned even those who had seen the political weather turning. Nebuchadnezzar II died in 562 BCE, after 43 years on the throne. What followed was one of those painful, familiar sequences that ancient empires seemed almost constitutionally unable to avoid. A rapid succession of weak kings, internal power struggles, assassination, and the slow hemorrhaging of political cohesion that occurs when a state built around a single dominant personality suddenly finds itself without one. In the 23 years between Nebuchadnezzar's death and the fall of Babylon, no fewer than 5 kings sat on the Babylonian throne. 5 kings in 23 years is not governance. It is managed chaos. And managed chaos in a world of patient and powerful rivals is an invitation. The invitation was accepted by Cyrus II of Persia, known to history as Cyrus the Great, a title he earned with a thoroughness that makes the honorific feel almost understated. He was the founder of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, a man of military genius and, perhaps more surprisingly, of considerable political intelligence. By 539 BCE, he had built an empire that stretched from the borders of India to the edges of Anatolia. Babylon, rich and prestigious and increasingly poorly governed, was the logical next step. What happened next is one of the strangest and most debated episodes in ancient history. Because Babylon did not fall the way great cities are supposed to fall, there was no apocalyptic siege, no years of starvation behind crumbling walls, no last heroic stand in the streets followed by fire and massacre. According to multiple ancient sources, including the Cyrus cylinder, a clay barrel inscription produced by Cyrus himself, and the Babylonian Chronicle, a contemporaneous historical record. The Persian army entered Babylon in October of 539 BCE with minimal resistance. The gates, by some accounts, were opened. The city was taken, as one ancient source memorably put it, like a man walking through a door that has been left ajar. Exactly why this happened remains a matter of scholarly discussion. The last Babylonian king, Nabonidus, was deeply unpopular. He had neglected the cult of Marduk in favor of the moon god Sin, a theological shift that alienated the powerful Babylonian priesthood in ways that had practical political consequences. Cyrus, with characteristic shrewdness, presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, a restorer of proper Marduk worship, a king chosen by the Babylonian gods themselves to set right what Nabonidus had corrupted. The Cyrus cylinder, sometimes called the world's first human rights charter, though that description is contested and probably somewhat anachronistic, presents this narrative with polished conviction. Cyrus as the righteous king, welcomed by gods and people alike, treating the Babylonians with respect, allowing their religious practices to continue, permitting exiled peoples to return to their homelands. Among those permitted to return were the exiled Hebrews. The Book of Ezra records the decree of Cyrus, allowing the Jewish people to go back to Jerusalem, to rebuild their temple, to reconstitute their community in their ancestral land. It is a moment of extraordinary historical resonance. The city that had shattered Jerusalem and driven its people into exile now, under new management, releasing them. The prophet Isaiah had called Cyrus, astonishingly, the anointed of the God of Israel. a remarkable theological claim about a Persian king who worshipped different gods entirely, but one that reflects how completely the Babylonian exile had reshaped Jewish theological imagination, expanding it outward into a vision of divine action that operated across all peoples and all kingdoms, not merely within the borders of a single nation. Babylon, under Persian rule, remained for a time a great city. Cyrus treated it well. His successors Cambyses and Darius maintained it as one of the capitals of the Persian Empire, a city of administration and commerce and continued cultural vitality. The astronomical traditions continued, the scribal schools continued, the temples continued. For several generations, Babylon was absorbed into the Persian Empire without being diminished by it. A remarkable testament to the depth and resilience of the civilization Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar and the long centuries between them had constructed. Then came Alexander. In 331 BCE, Alexander of Macedon, 25 years old, already the conqueror of Egypt and the destroyer of the Persian Empire, entered Babylon, and unlike so many conquerors before and after him, he was not indifferent to what he found there. He was overwhelmed by it. He walked through the Ishtar Gate and stood before the ziggurat and consulted the Babylonian astronomers whose records he understood, even without fully comprehending their content, to be something without parallel in the world. He planned to make Babylon the capital of his empire. Not Macedon, not Greece, not even Persia, but Babylon, the oldest and greatest city in the world, the place that felt, even to the conqueror of the known world, like the center of things. He never had the chance. In June of 3020 BCE, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, in the city he had chosen as his capital, Alexander the Great died. He was 32 years old. The empire he had built fractured almost immediately among his generals, and Babylon, passed between rival claimants and gradually overshadowed by the new Hellenistic city of Seleucia being built nearby on the Tigris, began the long, slow process of emptying. Not dramatically, not all at once. Cities rarely die in a single moment. They thin out slowly over generations, the merchants finding better opportunities elsewhere, the administrators following the seat of power as it moves, the ordinary people drifting toward wherever the water and the work and the safety are. The temples fell into disrepair. The irrigation systems, without the institutional maintenance that only a functioning state can provide, silted up and failed. The mud brick walls, without constant attention, began to melt back into the earth from which they had been made. By the early centuries of the Common Era, Babylon was largely abandoned. By the time Arab geographers described it in the medieval period, it was a landscape of mounds and fragments, recognizable as something extraordinary, but no longer legible as the city it had been. And yet it was never entirely forgotten. It could not be forgotten because too much of it had been written down. The Hebrew scriptures remembered it. The Greek historians remembered it. The Roman writers remembered it. The Islamic scholars who preserved and transmitted classical knowledge through the medieval period remembered it. Babylon moved through human memory, not as a ruin but as an idea of grandeur, of ambition, of the vertigo-inducing scale of what human beings could build when they organized themselves around a shared vision with sufficient time and will. In 1899, the German archaeologist Robert Koldewey began systematic excavations at the site near the modern Iraqi city of Hilla, and the physical Babylon began to re-emerge from the earth. The Ishtar Gate, the processional way, the foundations of the Great Palace, the outlines of temples and residential quarters, and the mathematical precision of the street grid. Thousands upon thousands of clay tablets, many still unread, still waiting in museum archives and university collections for the scholars who will eventually open them and find inside some piece of the Babylonian world that no living person yet knows. That last detail deserves to sit with you for a moment. We have recovered an enormous amount from Babylon, and what we have recovered has already reshaped our understanding of human history so fundamentally that it is difficult to overstate. But there is more. There is still more in the earth, and more in the archives, more pressed into clay by hands that trusted, correctly, as it turned out, that what they wrote would last. So why does Babylon still matter? Not as a ruin, not as an archaeological site, but as a living presence in the human story. It matters because it reminds us that civilization is not a modern invention, that the complexity of organized human life, the laws, the cities, the literature, the science, the theology, the art, the trade, the education, the rights, the bureaucracy, the beauty, goes back far deeper than we instinctively feel it does. That's 6,000 years ago, on a flat plain between two rivers. People were already grappling with the same fundamental questions we grapple with today. How to live together justly,